probably the most published and articulate writer on Kashmiri Shaivism in the various texts of Abhinavagupta, was a brilliant scholar by the name of Thakur Jaidev Singh. And he wrote a number of translations, and they are disciplined, brilliant books with incredible information and knowledge. He has a number of Abhinavagupta's texts in the original Sanskrit, and I very much enjoy this writer and his texts. But there is a flaw. And this flaw is something that we can recognize, and it's very revealing to us. The flaw in his books is the translation of a single word from Sanskrit to English. And that word is akshara. A word that keeps coming up again and again and again. I think we've used this word akshar in every single master class we've had. What does akshar mean? Akshar means syllable. It means phoneme, right? We've put a lot of focus on syllables and phonemes. Now, how does Thakur Jaidev Singh translate akshar? He translates it as letter. Now I want you to think about this for a second. What does that reveal? And mind you, this is a very serious scholar and academic and representator, agent, as it were, of Kashmiri Shaivism. Probably the #1 guy in the English language. But he uses this word letter. What does that tell us? Anybody have any ideas?
That he's coming from the kind of written end of it rather than the oral end of it?
You got that exactly right. Of course. Now, how can a scholar, an academic, what other access do they really have besides the written, printed, and published text? This is what academics do. They read texts. They read and compare texts, and they do analyses of texts. But who wrote those texts in the first place? Where did the first manuscripts come from? Now, did your grandmother or great-grandmother or your auntie need to buy the books of fairy tales to tell you stories? Of course not, right? The stories that are in your families, you know, that came from your great-great-grandparents and so forth, those stories, you don't have to get the book to get the story, right? The story comes down through the family lineages and through the communities. However, if somebody from outside of your community or outside of your culture listened to your grandmother's stories and said, "Oh, wow, those are really great stories. Do you mind if I write them down?" And then 1 day later, 1 year later, or a couple of years later, they're published in another language in another country, and people love to read those stories. And I'm saying that there is a similar kind of process that has gone on with not only the texts of Kashmiri Shaivism, but all the texts that we've been talking about so far and will continue to talk about. The students, the chelas, the disciples, And the master didn't need a manuscript, didn't need a written text. They had it memorized. This is clearly the case. They had it memorized, and they could refer to things completely oral. They didn't have to look anything up. Everything was memorized. But then there were occasions. Perhaps a visiting king or some sort of royalty or whatever would be visiting or would hear about the great discourses of a man like Abhinavagupta, and he would make an offer to somebody to create a manuscript, or perhaps he would present the manuscript to somebody else as a gift. And this is how many of the manuscripts were created in the first place. There is not the emphasis on the accuracy of speech. After all, this is not the performance of ritual. This is not the performance of passing down a tradition. Right? This is an object, usually some sort of gift for somebody. This is the first consideration. Now, the second consideration is this, that not only does Abhinavagupta make very clear, but all these, Patanjali, Panini, they all make this very clear, is that there is an assumption that when somebody is receiving these teachings, hearing the text, that they're already proficient in this knowledge. That the texts that are composed by these tantric masters are not for the beginner. These are something that are encountered after there is this enormous background, because as Bhartrihari made very clear in his discussion of spota, and spota regarding the sentence, that there are assumptions in speech. There are incredible assumptions in speech that go far beyond the words, that have historical, geographical, sociological inputs that change them. Just you can imagine when watching a film, somebody says something in a particular accent to make an effect. It could be a British accent or a Texas accent or a Russian accent, right? But an accent, just the fact of an accent, would change the understanding of a sentence. So there are built-in assumptions in the texts of these tantric masters. So, what we want to do is we want to continue to keep this connection between speech and consciousness, so that when we go on to discuss the particularities of Abhinavagupta and some of these texts, that we are not discussing these in ideological terms, that we are looking for the application. How do we move from the apparent world to our inner consciousness. What is that process? How do we use the world to arrive at ourselves? Now, philosophically, I would say that's probably one of the ways, the general statements that we could make of Kashmiri Shaivism and Tantra in general. That we want to, that we're not going to ignore the world and close our eyes and try and go inside, but we're going to realize that the world itself is our tool to reach our own identity. And this way of unraveling the world back to ourselves is the way of speech.